I will look into the eyes of every voter right now and say bread is evil and accepts human sacrifice.
I went on Tim Pool's show for a civil debate, but it did not go the way I expected. But now let's get into the part of the podcast where things got nasty and kind of unhinged. We talked a lot about China, which we do insane amounts of trade with China, and we rely on them and their production systems for basically everything Americans consume, from clothing to materials to food and electronics and so many other things. But Tim basically wanted to cut off all trade with China, seemed to not care what any of the economic consequences of that would be, based on moral outrage over some anecdotal, horrific, and truly terrible things that happen in China, which is, of course, an oppressive and horrific country in terms of their government in many ways. Take a listen to this clip where he talks about a Foxconn facility in China in a story from 2010.
Should we suspend trade with any country that has something like this happen? 150 Chinese workers at Foxconn threatened to commit suicide by leaping from the factory in protest of their working conditions. Foxconn installs anti-jumping nets. Here's a photo of the anti-suicide nets. Is this okay and for free trade? I mean, graph go up?
I remember this happened.
Hang on. Let me answer this question. So you just showed one terrible story from a country with billions of people and asked me if we should shut down trade with a whole country based on one anecdotal story from 2010 about one company in horrific conditions. By that logic,
Let's pause.
Sorry.
I'm gonna talk over you if you try to reframe the argument. I said, from this story, should we have shut down trade with China over, at this time, this specific incident occurring?
A whole country.
Yes.
Over one
It's
company.
a simple yes or no question.
No, we shouldn't.
Okay.
You can see there how he went on and on for minutes in the build up to this, but as soon as I started speaking, had to just interrupt me and shout over me for reframing it when I'm literally addressing his exact point. But anyway, my point is this little clip I just showed you, this exchange kind of reveals the demagoguery behind a lot of Tim's rhetoric in this conversation. He cited one horrific, emotionally compelling example from quite a long time ago, and then wanted to argue that because of that, we should shut down trade with an entire country of billions of people. And the point I tried to make before he shouted me down was that if we were going to do that, one horrific thing happening in a country means we can't trade with them. We couldn't trade with very many countries, and basically no one could trade with America. They just have to find one horrible place where illegal immigrants are being abused in labor conditions or something in our country, and then, oh, America, terrible, don't trade with them. Now, to be clear, China has some very problematic practices and terrible labor conditions and horrific human rights abuses. And it's not just one place, but that argument he was using was literally just one example that's actually really flawed as an example if you look at, again, any sort of statistics or data, rather than just an emotional story from 15 years ago. Foxconn, the company he's talking about that produces electronics in China, had this big controversy in the 2010s over the suicide nets and terrible working conditions. And I'm not defending their working conditions. I'm sure they were very bad. And I think they did improve in part in response to this controversy. But the notion of these mass suicides doesn't exist. It's not real. If you just look at the data, you'll see that. In 2010, when the Foxconn suicides gained significant media attention, the company employed approximately 930,000 people. During that year, there were 14 confirmed suicides at Foxconn facilities. That translates to a suicide rate of 1.5 per 100,000 employees. Meanwhile, the overall suicide rate in China that year was somewhere between 14 to 30 per 100,000 people. So the Foxconn employees were killing themselves at much lower rates than Chinese people in general or Chinese people that work at other companies. It's not a representative example at all. It's just an emotionally charged, horrifying story to try to reach broad-based conclusions about billions of people based on one anecdote that tugs at the heartstrings. That's how woke people make arguments. And apparently, MAGA leaders like Tim Pool. And he talked a lot about forced labor and modern day slavery in China and these terrible things and kept trying to suggest that I somehow support that, though I obviously don't. And I looked into it even more after our conversation, and what I found was that about 0.4% of China's population is living in modern slavery. That's terrible. That's horrible. That's evil. And it's especially common in certain industries and regions and areas. And my point was that we shouldn't cut off trade with the whole country, which would raise the cost of living for Americans by thousands and thousands of dollars per year. We should maybe sanction specific companies or restrict trade with certain sectors or regions that are doing this. And sure, try to wield some influence to stop the practice, but we shouldn't totally hamstring our whole country economically to protest something happening with a relatively small percentage of their population and workforce. You might disagree with my opinion there, but does that make me evil? Because for just saying that, I was screamed at and literally called evil by Tim Pool. Take a listen.
If but one person is living as a slave, I have a problem with that and don't see why graph go up, why we should make money in any way off of a foreign country that is doing something like this.
So one person living as a slave in a country of billions of people, what you just said, we should write off trade with the whole country.
It's really simple, actually. When Donald Trump calls him on the phone and says, you will right now get that man freed and declare it. Otherwise, we'll put a 30% tariff on all your goods. Guess what that country does? It frees that slave. You are saying you accept a certain degree of mass suicide so that your graph go up.
That is not what I'm saying.
So you think we should
maybe we should sanction trade with Foxconn. Maybe we should restrict trade in that industry. Maybe that specific region of China you suspend. It's horrible. It's evil. China's evil. I don't know what you're trying to make me say about
we should not do trade
with anything with China. Okay, you explain that to Americans when every single thing they rely on and buy gets more expensive after years of inflation under Biden.
I will.
You come in, MAGA comes in and says, all right, you know what? You guys elected us because everything's so unaffordable. Fuck it.
I will stand on top of a mountain. I will stand on top of a mountain and say, and directly into the eyes, I will do it right now. To every voter, I will look into the eyes of every voter right now and say, Brad is evil and accepts human sacrifice so that you can have a cheap iPhone. And if you're willing to buy a cheap iPhone, knowing that people are committing mass suicide, you stand along with them.
So I'm
and I will
evil
stand on the
because
other
I
side.
disagree with you about trade policy?
Because you think there's an acceptable degree of mass suicide and concentration camps so that your economy can improve.
I don't think that. You're shadowboxing with a caricature. Well, that clip was quite something, and it was something to be there. And have somebody tell you you're evil because you disagree with them about what the most appropriate trade policy is. Like, wow, I honestly wasn't expecting that. It caught me off guard. And of course, I already went over how some of what he's saying is just not true. There was no mass suicide at Foxconn. The suicide rate for Foxconn employees was much, much lower than the overall Chinese population. But of course, it is true that horrific human rights abuses occur in China at the hands of the Chinese government. I don't dispute that. The question is whether we can still trade and benefit from certain Chinese products or whether we cut off trillions of dollars of trade over them doing some things that are wrong and evil. Are we going to do that with every country that we trade with that does very immoral things? And he has this very naive notion to me that Trump can call them up and tell them to stop and they'll just listen. That didn't happen in Trump's first term. He put tons of tariffs and penalties and restrictions on China, telling them to change their bad economic practices like their IP theft and many other things. They didn't do that. They just expanded trade with other places and relied on the US for exports less. They did not listen to Trump and his imperial strength and say, oh, yes, Daddy Trump will bow to you and say, oh, yeah, you're going to tariff us if we don't do what you want. They literally just didn't listen to him. And so I don't see why that would be different this time. Frankly, decoupling the economies of China and the US would hurt both countries tremendously. But from the research I've read, it would hurt Americans more. China could better adapt than we could. He has this very, I think, naive view of what Trump could do here. And it's strange also because I feel like this same crowd, the America First crowd, doesn't believe that America should be the moral police of the whole world when it comes to our military and our imperialistic ambitions and these kinds of things. And I tend to agree with them on most of that to some extent. But then they want to be the economic police of the world and only trade with countries that have pristine human rights records and punish and cut off trade with entire nations because of things that they do in their government that are wrong. I mean, it seems inconsistent to me. And also, it's not even what Trump says he wants to do. He wants to even tariff the places that don't have the crimes and human rights abuses like China does. But regardless, look, the US-China relationship and trade is a freaking complicated subject. And I don't think you are evil or even necessarily dumb or anything like that if you disagree with me. If you have a different position, we should have that conversation. That's what I was hoping to do on Tim Pool's podcast. But he, at least in this one conversation, came off as incredibly intellectually arrogant and close-minded, as well as very angry and rude and kind of unpleasant. But I think that's what's wrong with media today. Yes, establishment media, but also some forms of new media and YouTube media where people just want to yell at people for clips or for, I don't know, to make their audience feel happy and not actually have serious dialogues and conversations. That's not my approach. It's not what I want to do. I will have heated debates and back and forth, but I try to discuss the issues, not insult people personally. That's just me. And hey, look, now I know that that's not Tim Pool. So I won't be heading out back to West Virginia anytime soon, but I do appreciate them having me out there. His staff were great, very friendly, very helpful. And hopefully you guys learned or enjoyed something from the debate. I can't say I think it came out great, but if some people got some benefit from hearing some of the exchanges that happened, I guess I'll have to take that as a win.